Hi, everyone. This is Miss Lasar, and today I'm going to be teaching you about the carbon cycle. Here's how we'll do this. We are going to start by talking about the law of conservation of matter. We will draw a detailed diagram of the carbon cycle. We'll talk about a few more carbon cycle details, and we'll end with human impacts to the carbon cycle. If you haven't noticed already, this is not going to be an outline format video. This will be a free form format. Your goal is to stay organized as you write down your notes, remembering that black is mandatory, blue is optional. Think about what structure you want to use to keep yourself organized, and that will change a little bit when we get to number 2, the carbon cycle diagram, because we're going to be using a couple different colors to draw a diagram together. And I'll tell you more about that when we get there. So let's dive in with the law of conservation of matter. What is that? The law of conservation of matter is matter is never created or destroyed. Atoms are simply rearranged into new molecules. Another way of thinking about that is the atoms we start with are the atoms we end with, even if they've been rearranged. Here are two pictures that show chemical reactions, and you can see that the atoms on the left are the same as the atoms on the right, even though they're connected to each other differently. On the left of this equation, we have 4 red oxygen atoms. On the right, we have 4 red oxygen atoms. On the left, we have 1 black carbon. On the right, 1 black carbon. Looking at our equation on the right, we've got 2 green chlorines on the left, 2 green chlorines on the right. The atoms we start with are the atoms we end with, even if they've been rearranged. And this is really relevant to today's lecture because we're going to be looking at one particular atom, carbon, and we're going to be looking at how carbon atoms are rearranged into new molecules all the time. What are the processes that pull molecules apart, put them back together? Specifically, how can we follow carbon atoms on their journey through all the different molecules that they might end up being a part of? And you've actually already started thinking about this. This is a review of photosynthesis. It's all in blue, so you don't need to write this down. Just remind yourself of what's going on here. Remember that in photosynthesis, our carbon dioxide and water molecules are pulled apart. The 6 carbon atoms on the left are used along with 6 oxygen atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms to make one glucose molecule, and the remaining 12 oxygen atoms are used to make 6 oxygen molecules. And once again, the atoms that we start with are the same as the atoms that we end with, even though they've been rearranged into new molecules. Another example of the law of conservation of matter. We learned that cellular respiration and photosynthesis were all about rearranging atoms into different molecules as we transferred energy. This week, we're going to focus on the carbon atoms and the molecules they move between. Okay, now we're ready for part 2, drawing our carbon cycle diagram. And I want to show you how to hold your notebook paper for this. So you're probably on a piece of notebook paper that looks like this. You've titled the top carbon cycle notes. You've got a little bit of the law of conservation of matter at the top. And now I want you to take that notebook page and turn it 90 degrees so that you're looking at it like this, spirals on the top, and make sure you get all of the details of this diagram correct. This diagram is really important, and it will only be helpful to you if it's actually correct. If all of the arrows are pointing the right direction, if all of the labels are correct, if all of the processes are correct. So be really careful as we go through this together. Rotate your paper sideways. Get pens or colored pencils in 4 colors and prepare to fill out all of the rest of this page with a diagram of the carbon cycle. Pause the video and come back when you've got your 4 colors. Here we go. We're going to start by just imagining that my blank screen is the same as your blank piece of notebook paper that you've rotated so that you're holding it spiral side up. We're going to put our color key in the top right corner. My first color will be black, and I'll be using that to mark locations. My second color will be blue. I'll be using that to mark processes. My third color is green. I'll be using that for molecules. And my fourth color is red, and I'll be using that for human impacts. We're going to start with black, or whatever your first color is, and we're going to lay out the different locations that we'll be looking at in this diagram. Try to put them on your paper in the same place that I put them on the screen. For example, I put atmosphere at the top in the middle. Try to put it in the same place on your paper at the top in the middle. Then I have plants. Plants are kind of in the middle of the paper if we're looking vertically, but they're on the right-hand side. There's a little bit of space, an inch or two, that I've left over on the right. Animals are on the same level as plants, but a little closer to the middle. Underneath animals and plants, we have dead stuff. Below and to the right, so almost in the lower right-hand corner, we've got fossil fuels. Make sure that you're following my spacing. I do have a couple lines, a little bit of space underneath fossil fuels and to the right of fossil fuels. Looking to the left, I've got ocean, and ocean is in the middle of the left-hand side, and it's also in between the level of atmosphere and animals. Vertically underneath ocean, I've got marine shelled animals. Underneath that, with a little space still, don't put it right at the bottom, leave a little space. I've got ocean sediments and rock. And then in the top left corner, I have exposed rock. Okay, these are all the locations that I'll be going between, that my carbon atoms will be going between. Now, the rest of our marking will be processes, molecules, and then a little bit of human impacts. So let's start in the atmosphere. The most common carbon containing molecule in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. We're going to write out the name of the molecule and also its chemical formula so that you can actually see the carbon atoms. Carbon dioxide is a name, and you know that the formula looks like this: CO2. And I've actually underlined the C just to bring your attention to it. Remember, the carbon atoms are the whole point of this. And so in the atmosphere, carbon atoms are frequently combined with oxygen atoms to make carbon dioxide. How do those carbon atoms leave the atmosphere? Well, the carbon dioxide, is absorbed by plants during the process of photosynthesis, and it's used to make glucose and other larger organic molecules that we might construct after we've made that glucose. Let's write the formula for glucose below this. You know what it is: C6H12O6. And again, I've underlined the carbon atom to make it stand out. At the same time, plants are living things, which means that they are, of course, doing cellular respiration. And as they do this, they're breaking down glucose, and the carbon atoms get released back to the atmosphere in carbon dioxide molecules. Notice that my arrow for cellular respiration is kind of skinny. You could do a dashed line, you could just make it really light. I want to indicate that there's a lot more photosynthesis happening than there is cellular respiration happening when it comes to plants. And that'll be important later. It's mostly important because this means that plants are going to be absorbing more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than they are adding carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Overall, they're going to be removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Animals are different. Animals have to get their carbon atoms from plants by eating plants or consuming plants. So I'll draw an arrow from plants to animals and label it consumption, just fancy word for eating. When animals eat plants, they're eating the glucose and larger organic molecules, which means that inside animals, carbon atoms are in glucose and other larger organic molecules too. So again, let's write the formula for glucose underneath that: C6H12O6, underline the carbon. And animals are not removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but they are adding to it significantly, because animals will take that glucose and they will rip it apart to use the energy that's inside of it to make ATP. And the carbon atoms are released back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide during the process of cellular respiration. All right, we have a nice little loop that's already happening. The thing is, animals and plants frequently die. So we're going to draw an arrow from animals and from plants pointing to dead stuff, and we'll just label it death. When animals and plants die, they become dead stuff. And as they die, nothing actually happens to the glucose and larger organic molecules. They don't just fall apart, which means that in dead stuff, our carbon atoms are still in glucose and larger organic molecules. And again, let's write the formula for glucose: C6H12O6. But the carbon atoms don't stay in the dead stuff because dead stuff gets eaten by decomposers. And the decomposers eat that glucose and they break it apart and use the energy to make ATP. You know what that is? That's again cellular respiration. So we're going to have an arrow curving around from dead stuff up to the atmosphere. We're going to label that respiration by decomposers. And what you're thinking about as you look at that arrow is this tells us that decomposers are eating the dead stuff. They're breaking apart the glucose to make ATP, and the carbon atoms get released back to the atmosphere as part of carbon dioxide molecules. Now is a good point to pause the video and see if you can recap what each of the arrows and labels actually means. For real, pause the video, try to say it out loud or in your head, recap what each of these arrows means, tell the story of how carbon atoms move, just like I did. Welcome back. Hopefully, you had a good time practicing that. Okay, you might be wondering why fossil fuels is still hanging on its own on the bottom right. Well, that's because it's pretty rare. Sometimes dead stuff gets trapped in a place where there are no decomposers. This actually doesn't happen very much anymore. Decomposers are pretty much everywhere. But millions of years ago, there were some areas where there were no decomposers. And if dead stuff got trapped there, and then got covered by soil and water, and a lot of time was also added to the equation. That dead stuff, through heat and pressure, would be transformed into fossil fuels. And the reason I've drawn this with a dashed line is to indicate that this is a really rare process. And you could even write that above the dashed line, rare process. In the fossil fuels, our carbon atoms are in a new type of molecule. They are in hydrocarbons. And the molecules that we're thinking about are oil molecules, natural gas molecules, and coal molecules. Those are our fossil fuels. So, what's the chemical formula for this? Well, it looks a little funky. It looks like this. That's C sub X, H sub Y, and the X and Y stand for numbers, but those numbers vary a lot. They can be lots of different options. It could be C2H4. It could also be C80H160. So there's a lot of variation there, and you'll actually learn more in chemistry about how to decide what those numbers should be. And that happened very rarely, very slowly. So we had a little trickle of dead stuff turning into fossil fuels. Some of those carbon atoms collected in fossil fuel reservoirs deep underground. Okay, let's look at the left-hand side of our diagram. And it's about the ocean. And so, what I don't want you to think is this is the only type of carbon cycle that happens in the ocean. Because in the ocean, we have animals, we have plants, we have them on land too. We've got dead stuff in the ocean, we've got dead stuff on land, we've got respiration by decomposers on land and in the ocean. So, all of the stuff that we've talked about so far is happening both on land and in the ocean. But it turns out that there's actually an additional part of the carbon cycle that really only happens in the ocean. So here's what's going on. First, we actually need to write down the two different types of carbon containing molecules that are in the ocean. Notice how I have them set up. On the left hand side, I have calcium carbonate, and the chemical formula for calcium carbonate, I'll back up so that's the only one you can see, is Ca, that stands for calcium, CO3, one calcium atom, one carbon atom, three oxygen atoms. This is calcium carbonate. On the right, I've got carbonic acid, and the chemical formula for that is H2CO3, two hydrogen atoms, one carbon atom, three oxygen atoms. And we're going to look at those two things separately because they are added to the ocean in different ways. Let's start with carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is formed when carbon dioxide from the atmosphere diffuses into the ocean. When there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is in the ocean, it will just naturally diffuse into the ocean. No living things are involved in this, it just happens. And the opposite will happen too. When there's more carbon dioxide in the ocean than there is in the atmosphere, it will diffuse out of the ocean back into the atmosphere, and it'll just diffuse back and forth, back and forth. And when the carbon dioxide diffuses into the ocean, it forms carbonic acid. So, what about calcium carbonate? Well, calcium carbonate is coming from rock. Take a look at the upper left hand corner. It's coming from a particular type of rock, limestone. The chemical formula for limestone is, oh, that looks familiar, CaCO3. That's the same formula as calcium carbonate. Limestone is just calcium carbonate. So, how does this rock end up in the ocean? Well, it's a process called weathering. Every time it rains over limestone, or the wind blows over limestone, or water flows over limestone, a little bit of that limestone is dissolved or eroded away and eventually swept into the ocean. And that's the primary source of new calcium carbonate in the ocean. So, what's the point of each of these things? Well, to talk about that, we have to look one level down. Below ocean, we have the marine shelled animals. That means animals that live in the ocean that have shells. Big ones like lobsters and crabs and mussels and oysters, and also tiny ones like tiny shrimp called krill and zooplankton. They're so tiny that some of them are microscopic and you can't even see them with your own eyes. Those marine shelled animals have calcium carbonate shells. That's where the carbon atoms are, which means that their shells are made out of CaCO3. Again, underline our carbon atoms so they stand out. Remember what the point of this is. And now the calcium carbonate above and the carbonic acid above will be relevant. Calcium carbonate will be used for shell formation. And I'm drawing an arrow from calcium carbonate to marine shelled animals. It's labeled shell formation. And this arrow is unique because it has a plus sign next to it. And that means promotes. Calcium carbonate promotes shell formation or is used for shell formation. My arrow from carbonic acid will be different. It has a minus sign next to it. Carbonic acid prevents shell formation. You could label that minus sign prevents or just remember it. Now, our marine shelled animals will at some point die. And as they die, they will drift to the bottom of the ocean. And as those layers of marine shelled animals at the bottom of the ocean sit on top of each other and get deeper and deeper, they actually compact from just sediments into rock. So, death and compaction of our marine shelled animals will lead to the formation of rock at the bottom of the ocean, and that is limestone rock. And we know what the formula for it is, that is CaCO3. But that's at the bottom of the ocean. How does it get to the top? Well, it happens when giant pieces of the Earth's crust, called tectonic plates, smash into each other and lift each other up. That's an earthquake. And we can label that with a big arrow pointing all the way up to exposed rock, tectonic plate uplift. The uplift, the crashing up of giant pieces of the Earth's crust called tectonic plates. Okay, we're almost done, and you notice we haven't used our fourth color. For me, it's red. Now's the moment. So, what you're looking at is the carbon cycle as it has existed for most of the history of life on Earth, except for the last 150 years. Because about 150 years ago, humans started doing one particular thing. We started mining and burning fossil fuels. So I'm going to draw an arrow from fossil fuels up to the atmosphere, and I'm going to label it human mediated combustion, indicating that as we mine fossil fuels and then burn them, that's what combustion means, the carbon from the fossil fuels gets returned to the atmosphere in carbon dioxide molecules. Okay, your carbon cycle diagram is now complete. Pause the video, practice some of these steps to yourself. Make sure you feel confident about what each of these arrows and each of these processes means. Now we're ready for part 3, carbon cycle details. I've got a couple key details for you. Here's the first detail. Fossil fuel formation, sedimentary rock formation, and plate tectonics are slow processes. I mean, super slow. The fossil fuels that we have today took about 50 million years to form. New sedimentary rock forming at the bottom of the ocean takes about 1 million years to form. And that sedimentary rock may be lifted up to the surface 1 billion years after it forms. I like this picture that just came up because you can see those white cliffs. Those are cliffs made of sedimentary rock that is pure calcium carbonate shells. That's why it's so white. And it contains shells that are almost 1 billion years old, which is unbelievable. Detail 2, photosynthesis, respiration, and diffusion are fast processes. And if you look at your diagram, you'll notice that all 3 of those processes involve adding and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which means that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere changes pretty quickly. Within a year, our first graph, you can see that carbon dioxide fluctuates pretty significantly. Our bottom graph shows how carbon dioxide has fluctuated in the Earth's atmosphere for the last 800,000 years, and it's pretty significant. We see some pretty major fluctuations. Our third detail is the amount of carbon atoms in any location, which we might call a pool, is constantly changing. And I've got a cool diagram to show you how much carbon, how many carbon atoms are in our general locations from our carbon cycle diagram. I'm going to make this diagram bigger so that you can see the details. What I want you to look at are the numbers that are in white. Let's start at the top. In the atmosphere, this number 800 indicates that there are 800 gigatons of carbon stored in the atmosphere. In plants, there are 550 gigatons of carbon stored. In the soil, there are 2,300 gigatons of carbon stored. In the ocean, the numbers get even bigger. Our surface ocean has about 1,000 gigatons of carbon. The deep ocean has 37,000 gigatons of carbon. Our arrows and our yellow numbers indicate how carbon is moving on a yearly basis. Again, let's look on land. About 120 gigatons of carbon are removed from the atmosphere by photosynthesis each year. About 60 gigatons are added back to the atmosphere during respiration. So, respiration is less than photosynthesis. We're removing more than we are adding. If we look over at our ocean, about 90 gigatons of carbon diffuse into the ocean and 90 gigatons of carbon diffuses out of the ocean each year. And what you're noticing in red, those red numbers, are how human activities have changed each of these processes. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Human impacts on the carbon cycle. Here's our final section. There's 4 impacts that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to have you write down each impact, and then I'll show you how it's caused. Our first impact is fossil fuel combustion leads to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Here's how. If we look back at our carbon cycle diagram, this red arrow is a new arrow. As we burn fossil fuels, it leads to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this is because burning fossil fuels I'm going to actually go back to the slide, it's a combustion reaction. Here's what a combustion reaction is. In a combustion reaction, we take a hydrocarbon on the left, we combine it with oxygen gas, we add a little bit of a spark and it starts burning. As we break apart our hydrocarbon molecules, a bunch of energy is released. That's the heat and light that you see in fire. And the atoms from our hydrocarbons and our oxygen gas molecules are recombined into carbon dioxide and water. So our primary products are carbon dioxide and water. And this is the carbon dioxide that is released anytime you burn a hydrocarbon. So now I'm going to go back and let me show you why we're actually burning hydrocarbons, how they're related to your life. So we burn hydrocarbons for 3 main reasons. We burn fossil fuels to generate electricity. And the primary fuels that we use to create electricity are coal and natural gas. We're burning them in a power plant. And in that power plant, we're converting the chemical energy in those fuels into electrical energy that flows through our power lines. We also burn fossil fuels to generate heat, especially in your house, your stove. If you have heating oil or if you have a furnace, those are going to be burning natural gas or oil. And finally, we burn fuels to generate movement. And that's our gas powered cars and our fuel powered planes. In both cases, the gas or the fuel or the diesel that we're burning is not natural gas, it is oil. It's all derivatives or modified products of oil. So remember, in all of these cases, we are burning some sort of hydrocarbon, we're burning a fossil fuel. And as we just saw, when we burn a hydrocarbon, the carbon atoms get recombined with oxygen atoms and they are released back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide molecules. And this is why fossil fuel combustion leads to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Our second impact is deforestation leads to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Let me show you what I mean by deforestation. Something like this. where we cut down and remove a whole bunch of trees, a whole bunch of plants that were present initially. This is what people usually think of. This is deforestation for mining. You can actually see that in some places our soil has even been removed, and we can see the rock material that's being mined from this area. But most deforestation doesn't look this dramatic. It looks like this. We see grass, we see a pasture. You can't even tell that we've removed stuff because you're like, that grass looks totally normal. But this used to be a forest, and we've cut down. You can see the stumps of all of the dead trees. We've cut down a bunch of trees, and we've planted grass there instead. And this is for the cows that you can see grazing here. The primary driver of deforestation is clearing land to plant grass for cattle production. The problem here is that even though we have plants, we don't have as many plants. Big trees do a whole lot more photosynthesis than little blades of grass. So here's how that impacts our carbon cycle. As we deforest an area, the number of plants we have decreases. This means that the total amount of photosynthesis happening in that area will also decrease, which means that the total amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere will decrease, which means more carbon dioxide will be left in the atmosphere, so carbon dioxide levels will increase. Okay, impact three, the impact of that more carbon dioxide. More carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to climate change. Two things to note. Note these details under detail 3. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. A greenhouse gas is a molecule that traps heat in the atmosphere. The more there are, the warmer the Earth's temperature. And we can see this pattern as we look over the last 800,000 years of Earth's history. On the top, our blue line represents how much carbon dioxide there has been in the Earth's atmosphere. On the bottom, the orange or red line indicates the temperature of the atmosphere. You can see that as carbon dioxide rises, temperature also rises. As carbon dioxide falls, temperature falls. These two things are extremely closely linked because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere directly impacts the temperature of the atmosphere. If we look at recent times, we've already said that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is dramatically increasing. And that primarily started when we started burning fossil fuels. You can actually see when that happened. That started happening in the 1800s and really picked up steam towards the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. And as we burn more and more fossil fuels and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, the temperature of the atmosphere has done the same. And you can see that both of these are exponential growth curves, which means they're not slowing down yet. Our final human impact is this, number 4. More atmospheric carbon dioxide also leads to ocean acidification. Let me show you what that is. So, as there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide will diffuse into the ocean, which means we'll have more carbonic acid in the ocean. You know that carbonic acid stops shell formation, which means that the amount of shelled animals will go down. This is actually a big problem because all of those little shelled animals are not just beautiful animals like coral, they're necessary animals like zooplankton. Those are the base of our food web. More carbonic acid makes it harder for organisms to build their shells. Consider the impacts on the marine food web, the ocean food web, global food availability, and human economies. People who rely on ocean food, on ocean animals for their primary food sources, and also for their jobs and local economies. Some closing thoughts. Carbon cycle affects the food that we eat, the air we breathe, the electricity we use, and the weather around us. We've caused some major changes in global processes. These changes impact the way we live. Understanding our place in the carbon cycle allows us to control our personal influences on the carbon cycle and understand the changes we are seeing around us. I hope that this lecture gave you a lot of things to think about, and we'll talk about this more in class. See you later, everyone.